Hi, my name is Linda Vida, and I'm the director of the Water Resources Center Archives. And I want to welcome you to the last colloquium of the fall semester. And also to let you know that we do have our slate set for the spring. I don't have the names with me. I'm not going to read them off, but I just wanted to let you know that the room has been changed back to 105 Northgate Hall. So in the spring, we'll be back in Northgate. And I also wanted to mention that we've been videotaping all the lectures for several years now, and we do have video copies available for loan at the archives. And also starting this semester, we have it streaming on the web. So you can watch it on the web. And I also wanted to plug our calendar, Driving the Bay, which is available for $13. We have some brochures, I hope, up there by our flyers. So we do this in conjunction with the Transportation Library here on the Berkeley campus. And also, I would like to thank my fabulous staff at the archives. And I don't know if you're not too embarrassed, would you stand? Nancy Nowitzki, Trina Punders, and Paul Atwood. And they're the ones that take care of all of the behind-the-scenes things, whether it's logistics for arranging the room or with the speakers or updating the website or a myriad of things. So this would not be possible without them. Thank you. And I'll turn it over to Professor Narasimhan.
Well, on behalf of all the faculty, and we should also thank Linda for taking care of all the arrangements so far, and she has been the inspiration. The Water Resources Center Archives, being a library, provides us a very non-disciplinary or interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary atmosphere to invite everybody dealing with water to this colloquium. And thanks to Linda for all that. And today, as Linda said, this is our last colloquium for this semester. We have heard about earthquakes, we have heard about coastal waters, and we are now going to hear today about human follies and foibles in a highly technological society. Everybody is going to be a very hotshot, intelligent person, and how it takes a lot of intelligent people to screw up a lot of things. So we'll hear about that today. And today I also want to take this opportunity to thank one of our strong supporters from the very beginning. The Dean of the College of Letters and Science is here, and the real strength of this colloquium has been, apart from the money, which is very important, it is the intellectual protoplasm, if you will, that water has provided to bring almost every college, every discipline in this campus, and how all the deans have so spontaneously responded and have been supporting this for several years. And so we thank them all for making this possible. With that, I will invite Professor Joseph Sachs, one of the leading proponents of water law in this country, to introduce our speaker today.
Thanks, Nari, and I want to welcome all of you this afternoon to this last colloquium of the semester. I would like to say I have been eagerly awaiting this particular presentation for a number of months. As you already know from looking up on the screen, Robert Glennon holds the Morris Udall Chair in Law and Public Policy at the University of Arizona. And I can see from some of you who have the book with you that he's well known to many of you as the author of Water Follies, this very new and much admired and much discussed book. But in addition to that, or beyond that, and from the perspective of people like myself who work in the water law area, it's important to acknowledge that he is also one of the pioneers in writing in the scholarly area about groundwater issues and problems, and has made extraordinarily valuable studies, particularly of the groundwater situation in the state of Arizona. In addition to that, he has been an important figure and has written importantly as well about the environmental water problems raised by the delta, the Colorado River delta at the mouth of the river, a problem that greatly needs more attention, and hopefully will get some of that attention as a result of the work that he and some of his colleagues have done. I don't want to make a longer introduction, although I know a lot more of very complimentary things that I could say, but I'm sure you share my view that I would rather listen to him than listen to me talk about him. So without further ado, I give you Robert Glennon.
Thank you, Joe.
Okay.
Thank you, Joe.
I don't know if this thing, you have
I've got my own. So, thank you, Joe. He was sincere in all but one thing, and that was having to hear me again. He's heard me 3 or 4 times. The last time I finally said, Joe, after it was an after-dinner talk, I said, listen, after dessert, just slide out quietly. And he did. But now he has to sit here because he's going to be coming up at the end. It's great to be here, and thank you for everyone at the University of California. And Dean, appreciate the funding that you've given the program. It's good to be here. I have to say, coming from the University of Arizona, that I think Cal should be playing in the Rose Bowl. The only silver lining in this otherwise horrible situation is that because you're playing in the next bowl, our arch rival Arizona State isn't playing in that bowl. So we're happy that they had to go down someplace else. And now our team is like, I think, 2-72 this year. But we did beat ASU, so life is good in Tucson. It's good to be with you for another reason, and that is a group that cares about water. Golly, you know, you go around and you talk, and people say you've written a book, and they say, what's it about? And you say, groundwater. And the looks you get, oh my, you know, the Yankees finally were done in, the curse is broken, I mean, anything but to talk with you about what you've written about. I mean, you know, that just seems to be so arcane. Well, it's arcane at one level and very contemporary and very practical on another level. I want to talk, oops, that jumped over. Here we go. Okay, this first slide puts some basic stuff on groundwater in the United States before us. Most of this, I think, is familiar to you. They're all, I think, important bullets. But the one that just jumps off the page to me is this one here. That in the year 2000, the United States used an astonishing 30 trillion gallons of groundwater. Groundwater now constitutes over 1/4 of the nation's water supply. Over half of us in the United States use groundwater as our drinking supply. And this is as of the year 2000. That's the most recent year for which the U.S. Geological Survey has data. But of course, what's been happening since 2000? Historic drought. And in the 4 years since, what's happened is that cities and farmers and miners and individual homeowners scrambling in search of new water supplies have settled on groundwater. That's where they have turned. So these figures, as sobering as they are tremendously out of date. This graphic just tells you a little bit about where in the United States people use water. And in California, as you can see right here, it's almost half of us in California drink groundwater for a potable supply. I want to do a little primer on law. Not much, just a little bit. I have to do a little law because there's a theme here, and the theme is very simple. There's a disconnect between law and science. The scientists get the hydrologic cycle, and the legal system doesn't. Okay, so first, let's look to surface water law. And what we have in the United States, in eastern parts of the United States, we have something called riparianism. And under that system, if you own property on a river or a lake, you are automatically a riparian property owner, and you have water rights to that lake or that river. The water rights are shared water rights. You and all of your fellow property owners have rights to it. So they're contingent, correlative, dependent kind of water rights. In the American West, we went to a completely different system. we developed a prior appropriation system. And for surface water in the American West, that means the first person to make a diversion has the best, the senior, the highest priority rights. First in time is first in right. Anyone who comes subsequent to that senior appropriator during times of drought, such as we've been having, will have his or her water rights cut off 100%. Now here's the rub. When we go from this graph to the next one, what we see when we turn from surface water to groundwater is an almost completely different set of rules, with the exception of just a handful of states in the American West that apply a kind of prior appropriation to groundwater as well as surface water and therefore integrate the two systems. The rest of the United States has completely different rules. Most American states have the second bullet, the reasonable use doctrine. And the reasonable use doctrine is anything but what its name would suggest. Anything you want to do with water is reasonable. That's the reasonable use doctrine. The right of capture, believe it or not, is even worse. The right of capture treats water the same way that you might treat a wild animal, like a deer in the forest. It's unowned by anyone. And if you can shoot the deer, it's yours. Well, with the right of capture, you get it out of the ground, it's yours. Limitless quantities, no questions asked. Now, you might think, well, this is an odd way to run a legal system. One set of rules for groundwater, a completely different set of rules for surface water. But the problem is that in the 19th century, when groundwater rules developed, the state of the science of hydrology was quite primitive. And judges, not having guidance from the scientific community as to how water moved, shrugged their shoulders and said, well, you know, if you can get it out of the ground, then it's yours. Now, since then, of course, the science of hydrology is incredibly sophisticated, armed with computer models and elaborate mathematical equations. We know a ton about how water moves, but the legal system hasn't kept pace. It is just as if there were two different species of beings or animals, groundwater over here and surface water over there. So I've written some technical papers with a hydrologist as a co-author, critical of this and very critical, obviously, of the legal system. And I found, after publishing these papers, to my surprise, that I was receiving invitations to come and to speak to groups of hydrologists. And I thought, well, you know, why are they asking me to come talk to them? They understand the problem. It's not the science that's the problem, it's the law. And then I realized that's why I was being asked to come. It made lawyers look like idiots. Kind of a 30-minute lawyer joke, you know, Guinness Book of Records, you know. Put the suit in the front of the room and watch him make fun. The reasons are complicated as to why the legal system has not kept pace, but we have now a tragedy, and it is the classic tragedy of the commons. If there was ever an instance where that metaphor applies, this is it. So think of groundwater sitting in an aquifer as sitting in a giant milkshake glass. And think of each well as a straw in the glass. And what the legal system permits is a limitless number of straws in one glass. Absolutely bizarre. So the consequences, well, eventually you can run out. I mean, that's one horrible consequence. We haven't exactly run out in the Ogallala Aquifer, but this is the poster child for exploitive groundwater use. The Ogallala Aquifer touches 7 states. It goes from the Dakotas in the north down to the panhandle of Texas. It's been described as the breadbasket of the country. And during the 40s and 50s, thanks to revolution in technology, new motors, new bits, new turbines, we are now able to extract from commercial wells thousands of gallons of water every minute. And that's what we've done. And so the darker colors suggest the degree to which the water table has plummeted in the Ogallala Aquifer. There are other consequences of groundwater pumping. One is increased energy costs. And this is no more complicated than a function of the weight of water. Water is really heavy. And any of you who hike or backpack know that every time you take that quart Nalgene bottle and you put it in your day pack, you're adding 2 pounds of water to your load. Well, in the American West, we don't talk about water in terms of quarts or gallons. We talk about it in terms of an acre-foot. It's an agricultural term, a term that suggests how much water it takes to cover an acre of land to the depth of 1 foot. It's a lot of water. That's 325,000 gallons of water. An acre-foot of water weighs 1,358 tons. So if you're a farmer and you're looking at pumping from 500 feet below the surface of the earth, you're looking at multi-thousand-dollar electric bills for every well every month. That's more than enough to put farmers out of business. A decrease in quality. This seems to be a function entirely of the Earth's internal temperature being higher the further you go down toward the core of the Earth. And there's some pretty nasty stuff that will go into solution at lower levels with higher temperatures. And so as you pump more and more, and as the water table declines, there's a decrease in water quality. Saltwater intrusion. I have been shocked since Water Follies came out to learn more about this. I thought it was confined to Cape Cod, some places in Central California, Hilton Head Island, South Carolina. Near as I can figure now, except for the coast of Oregon and Washington, and even then I'm not sure, every place else in the United States that touches a coast has a problem with saltwater intrusion. Basically, you pump the fresh water out and the salt water migrates laterally. And then subsidence. And I love these photos. I particularly love the one on the left, which is a California story from San Joaquin. You can see that's where the level of the Earth was in 1925, and now down to 1977. So what's the subsidence stuff? How does this work? Well, for me to understand it, I think of a box of Kellogg's cornflakes. And you bring the box home, and you open it up, and the first thing you think is, Kellogg's ripped me off. It's already a third gone. I mean, what happened? Well, that's subsidence. If Kellogg's had been kind enough to have added a couple of cups of milk to the box of cornflakes, the flakes would still be right up to the top of the box. But instead, without the milk, as the flakes are packaged and then moved in transport, the flakes begin to settle. That's what you get on the left. And the middle two, or the middle one and the right one, are from Arizona, indicating the kinds of fissures that can open up from the vacuum created by the withdrawal of groundwater. But now I want to go elsewhere, because other people have talked about the impact of subsidence or water quality declines or some of these other environmental consequences. But what no one has done, not any prior book or even magazine article, is link groundwater pumping to the impact on water at the surface, on lakes, rivers, wetlands, estuaries. And in Water Follies, that's what I try to do. So first, let's go to Tucson. Anyone here visited Tucson? Ever visited Tucson? Oh, half the room. Gosh. Well, then you know, you probably laughed, as most tourists do, when you go to Tucson and you drive west on Speedway Boulevard, and you come to a sign, and the sign says Santa Cruz River. And you look over, and you start to laugh. And if you've been in Tucson, you know what I'm talking about. Because you look over, and there's no river. It's like a sandbox, something a 4-year-old should be playing in. And the tourists just say, my God, I knew I was visiting the Sonoran Desert, and I knew these desert dwellers were a little bit off. But you know, to think that this dry wash is a river is really nothing short of madness. Well, of course it's madness, but that's not the way it always was. There used to be a real river called the Santa Cruz River. That's why there's a city there. This is a historic photo from 1942, and it doesn't come across very well. There is water flowing there. I ask you to notice this odd-shaped rock in the foreground, but especially notice the incredible array of trees, a vast stand of mature cottonwood trees mixed with some willows that abuts the river. And now, note, rock hasn't moved. All the trees are gone. And so this is what you have seen, those of you who have visited Tucson. This is the Santa Cruz River. This is what we have done to a once vibrant river. We have dried up the river, we have killed the trees and the animals as well. Do you want me to move this down? Am I being too loud? No. Oh, okay, a little bit, sure. Okay, well, how does this happen? How does a river go dry? the concept here on the hydrologic cycle is a simple one, and it is that water can only move by force of gravity. And the gravity can come from a bunch of different places. It can come from that big yellow ball evaporating water off the ocean. It can come from wind moving the moisture. Oh, I can't see anyone now. There. That's good. This is probably back where it was. But it can come from wind taking the moisture-laden water across. It comes from gravity as it precipitates out. It comes from what we've seen the last couple of days, runoff, surface runoff with the streets and the river through campus here and the like. But the part of gravity that I want to call your attention to is this part over here, the infiltration. It percolates into the ground. Now, if that were the end of the story, that would be the end of my talk, but it isn't, because water continues to move. It doesn't just go down into the ground. It also moves laterally, subsurface, to provide flows to rivers, lakes, wetlands. I ask you to consider the following riddle. Where does water in a river come from if it hasn't rained recently? That's it. It's moving subsurface laterally by the force of gravity to provide flows to our rivers and our streams. And this diagram suggests much the same thing. The top one shows a healthy river where the water table adjacent to the river is above the level in the river, and as a consequence of gravity, the river is receiving water. If you think about it, the river is always the low point in the valley, in the basin, and it's the land above it that's generating the flow or generating the seepage into the river. And then what happens as the water table declines in the lower graph, you get the movement in the opposite direction. That's what happened to the Santa Cruz River. Plus, you add one more force, which is human intervention in the form of wells. And so what we have here is a process of intercepting water. The water is moving toward the river, toward the lake, toward the estuary, toward the wetland, but now doesn't get to the lake, river, or wetland. Instead, it's pumped out by the well. I want to give you one more quick slide of an Arizona story. This is also in my new state, or not so new state, I guess now, and it concerns the San Pedro River. This is a photo of it. It gives you a sense of what the Santa Cruz River must have been like at some point in the distant past. The fate of this river is very much up for grabs. Arizona has the reasonable use doctrine. Groundwater pumping is out of control in Sierra Vista. The growth machine is alive and well. Can't wait to put in new subdivisions with fancy-sounding names like Cottonwoods of the San Pedro, thereby contributing to the death of the trees that the subdivision's named after. But I want to go elsewhere now, because my message today is not about Arizona. It's not about arid lands, and it's not about the American West, though it is about all of those. It's really about a huge national and international problem that needs serious attention. So let's first go to Wisconsin. Anyone from Wisconsin? No one from Wisconsin. It's a great state. It's a state with abundant natural resources. They have 15,000 lakes. They have 8,000 miles of rivers. They have a citizenry that's alive and well. It is a blue state. And the progressivism of La Follette is evident in chapter and verse there. There are 700 or 800 groups concerned with watersheds, hunters groups, angling groups, hiking groups, you name it. The people in Wisconsin are there. The story I tell here, and it begins the book, is about bottled water. Bottled water. And I want you to think about the concept of bottled water. No one used to drink bottled water in the United States. Well, maybe here in Berkeley you drank bottled water. But I mean, or feed Italian restaurants or something. But in the hinterland, no one drank bottled water. There might have been a water cooler at the office or something. But the ubiquitous bottle that we see today, that's a new phenomenon. And what a phenomenon it is. It's everywhere. Next to every laptop in my classroom is the bottle of water. You go to the gym and everyone's got the bottle of water. The Stairmasters now even have a little place for the bottle of water to go. The movie theaters, people buy bottled water. And I ask you, have you noticed the price of bottled water at the movie theater? I mean, it costs more than the popcorn. Bottled water now sells for more money than milk, oil, gasoline, or things made with water, like Coke. Now go figure, how would you like to be Coke? You're sitting there in Atlanta, you've got this secret religious formula for this sweet, sugary syrup, and some character comes along and he says, I have a better idea. I'm going to put water in a bottle and sell it. Isn't life great? I mean, we human beings are just a charming lot. And we just can't get enough of this bottled water. It's all over. And it's good stuff. I mean, it's better for you than Coke or Pepsi or Gentleman beer. So it's better that you drink water than a lot of the other stuff that you're drinking anyway. Well, what's the problem with the environment then? Well, the problem is this, that when you drink bottled water in certain kinds, you're drinking spring water. And the marketing industry, particularly I'm talking about Nestle Waters North America. They used to be a Perrier subsidiary, which itself was Nestle, but they've renamed themselves now. It's Nestle Waters North America. They are the largest bottler of water in the United States. They have a 32% market share of all bottled water sales in the country. But you don't see it. You don't see it as Nestle water. You see it as Arrowhead, Calistoga, Iron Mountain, Zephyr Hill, Poland Spring, all of these regional brands, but they're all under the umbrella of Nestle. And Nestle has decided, for marketing reasons, that we American consumers will pay more money, will find greater cachet if we drink spring water than if we drink water that's labeled treated water, filtered water, groundwater, artesian water, or any of the other categories of Food and Drug Administration approved labels. Now, in order to sell spring water by Food and Drug Administration rules, you have to have the pump that gets the water be located next to the spring. So, back to Wisconsin. Wisconsin has one of the blue ribbon trout streams is the McCann River. And at the headwaters of the McCann are these creeks and springs that provide cold water to the river. It's a river the state's been protecting for over half century, conservation easements, purchasing of lands, doing some restoration work. They have wild reproducing strains of brook brown and rainbow trout. It's really a terrific little river. But they need the cold water. And the problem is that the state of Wisconsin has the reasonable use doctrine. If Perrier wants to put in a well, there's nothing in Wisconsin law that would prevent the company from doing exactly that. So Perrier came in and they said, we want to put in a well, and we will put in a well 60 feet away from the river. So 60 feet, what do you think? Maybe from here to the back of the room, 60 feet? Maybe not even that far, pretty darn close. And they were going to pump between 500 and 600 gallons of water per minute, of every hour, of every day in the year. 272 million gallons of water from this well adjacent to the little spring. And the spring itself was a small spring, carried a flow of between 3 and 5 cubic feet per second. So it was the kind of thing you could easily step over. The question, of course, is what was this pumping going to do to the spring? And the answer, fortunately, is nothing. And the reason why we know that is that that's what the Perrier hydrologist said. So I was confused, and I went back to the University of Arizona. I went back to Tom Maddock, and I said, Tom, my hydrology buddy. I said, Tom, the hydrologist says nothing's going to happen to this spring. And Tom snorted. He said, he's not a hydrologist. He's a hydrostitute. There are occasions when there can be reasonable disagreement about what the computer models project about what will in fact happen. And then there are occasions that don't meet what lawyers call the straight face test. If as a lawyer you cannot avoid breaking into a smile in making the argument on behalf of your client, that is a losing argument. You have to be able to keep a straight face. So saying that pumping 500 or 600 gallons a minute is not going to affect the spring. It just doesn't meet the straight-face test. For the moment, the McCann River is safe. The citizens did indeed rise up, though there was nothing under Wisconsin law to prevent the company from going ahead. For the moment, they decided not to. Instead, they went next door to Michigan, opened up a plant, and began to pump and pump and pump, and to Wisconsin, to Tennessee, and right here to California. Now I want to go elsewhere, from the Midwest to the Southeast, to Florida. Anyone from Florida? Okay, a couple people from Florida. Florida, I mean, it's amazing to think that Florida could have a water shortage problem. And I don't mean just this year with the 4 horrible hurricanes. I mean, Florida, let's face it, Florida's a swamp. We've been draining that thing for 150 years. But in fact, Florida has major water shortage problems. The story that I tell has to do with one section of Florida, the West Coast, the central West Coast, the Tampa Bay area. And you've got the 2 big cities of Tampa and St. Pete, both on peninsulas, both built out. And so in search of water supplies in the 70s and 80s, they went north to Pasco County and bought up huge tracts of rural land and proceeded to put in these immense well fields and pump and pump and pump. Here's an example of subsidence in the Florida area. And you can see this fellow standing on the side of this house-sized sinkhole. This is a different kind of subsidence than the Kellogg's cornflakes. This is karst limestone. And there, the limestone itself will collapse. It's water soluble, and as you move water through it, it collapses rather than settles. So that's how you get these sinkholes. Here's a before and after photograph. This is Crooked Lake from the 1970s. And Crooked Lake, it's 1990. The computer's cut off a little bit of the text on the right here tonight, from 1990. There are literally scores of lakes in west central Florida that have dried up from groundwater pumping. The story I tell is about Steve and Kathy Monty's, Midwestern kids. Steve was a hero in the first Gulf War. They were living outside Tampa and liked it, decided to retire there, bought some land on a lake, built their dream home, their retirement home, and then looked forward to living there once he returned from his last posting, which was in the Sudan. So in the early 90s he did, and they lived there, and the lake dried up. So instead of having their dream home on a lake overlooking the sun setting on the far side of the lake, they had mud-flat property. So they did everything you're supposed to do in a democracy. They made inquiries, they wrote letters, they attended meetings, they made telephone calls, and the utility just stonewalled them. Said it was the drought, said it was this, said it was that. Eventually, of course, it was obvious that the huge well field located right up the street was the problem. So at that point, the utility realized they had a major public relations disaster on their hands, and they needed to do something about it. And so what they decided to do was to refill the lake. Where do you think they got the water from to refill? They pumped more groundwater. They were pumping 375,000 gallons of groundwater a day, dumping it into the lake where, of course, it didn't stay. It immediately percolated into the ground. It was like trying to keep water in a colander. It just went right into the ground. A great water folly. But it gets better. You might have thought that the engineers would have said, bad, we need to go elsewhere. No, no, no. This concept, these engineers said, only needs tweaking. If we drain the lake once again, we can line the lake with an impermeable material and then redump the water into it. What I like, in part, are stories of our human capacity, our infinite human capacity to ignore reality. And this is one. The bottled water one, I think, is another one. And the way that goes is, if Perrier had moved its well 2 miles away from Schmudlack Creek and the springs, it would have obtained water with the exact same chemical composition, but it couldn't have sold the water as spring water. So what is the deal? Is it us weird American consumers with such a fetish for the cachet of spring water? Or is it some company that's created this niche that's totally magical, totally nonsensical? The same chemical composition, but they couldn't call it spring water. I don't know. We're an odd group, we humans. Let's go to Texas. Anyone ever visit San Antonio and the Riverwalk? Okay, good number, good number. It's an incredibly vibrant downtown, huh? They've got the boats on the river going up and down. There's mariachi bands adjacent to them. There are wonderful clubs and boutiques and restaurants and hotels and shops. There is only one thing missing, and that is a river. There is no river. What there is groundwater pumped out of the Edwards Aquifer and dumped into the dry San Antonio River bed. They dried that river up in the early 20th century from groundwater pumping. And so now they take water from the Edwards and put it in and then recycle it back up and around to create the economically useful fiction of a real river. Once a year they drain it in January and they take out the beer bottles and the silverware, quote, because the tourists like it natural. They've gone one further. They've now decided that they should use the water first. So it's groundwater pumped out of the Edwards, used in the metropolitan system for all kinds of domestic purposes, and then run through the metropolitan effluent plant, and as effluent, then dumped into the river. Still groundwater. San Antonio is the largest city in the United States, 100% dependent on groundwater. It is desperate to find new sources. Texas has the rule of capture, the wild animal concept. You get it out of the ground and it's yours. The story I tell here is about a local entrepreneur who teams up with a slumlord from New Jersey, and they decide to go in the water business. And they said, gosh, if we can find some water, we'll make a lot of money. So they put in wells. Now, the flow of water in the Edwards Aquifer goes from the northwest to the southeast. And in this section of Texas, they measure the amount of water in storms in terms of feet, not in terms of tenths of inches. They get really quite the storms. So it's a very productive aquifer. And there are places where you will get artesian pressure, where if you could puncture into the water layer, you could get an upwelling of water. And by golly, these guys hit it. They put in a well with a diameter of 30 inches, and they hit pay dirt. It erupted. It was like a freight train rumbling. It sent a column of water 45 feet straight up in the air. This one well was producing 43 million gallons of water a day. So, thankful for their blessings, they named the well Ave Maria number 1. I think the number 1 is really a nice touch. I mean, you know where these people were, this was just the start of something big and beautiful. Then they had to figure out, what do you do with Ave Maria number 1's water? What do you do with 43 million gallons of water a day? They decided to raise catfish. Even in Texas, even with the rule of the biggest pump, with the right of capture, in a state where 43 million gallons would be 1/4 of the seventh largest city in the country's needs, this was over the top. This was just too much. So the city of San Antonio came in, bought them out for a cool $10 million. San Antonio still needs more water, and now they've looked elsewhere. And where they have looked is up to the Panhandle, to some property owned by Mr. T. Boone Pickens, famous as a takeover artist of the 1980s, corporate takeover artist. And he's got an idea. And Mr. Pickens' idea is that he will sell groundwater pumped from beneath his ranch to San Antonio. Now, Texas is a big state, and the Panhandle is not near San Antonio. But there are two things I think of interest about Mr. Pickens' proposal. First, remember the Ogallala Aquifer? It goes all the way down to the Panhandle. There's no water beneath Mr. Pickens' ranch. They've been depleting that for the last 50 years. What he really wants to do is to sell the modest amount of water currently under his ranch and then draw to his wells water from beneath his neighbors' lands to his wells. I suggest it's like trying to sell the sleeves out of his vest. The second thing I would point out is when we in the West, and you Californians know it better than anyone, when you think about big water boondoggles, when you think about Cal-Fed, or we in Arizona, when we think about the Central Arizona Project, when we think about moving water over mountains, beneath tunnels, doing all these multi-billion-dollar things, the first thing we think of, let's be candid, right, is the federal government's money. That's the role of the federal government. We want ignorant taxpayers from Virginia to foot the bill for these water projects. Because we in the West, we may be rubes out in the desert, but we aren't so stupid as to put our own money to play for these ridiculous projects. That's the role of the federal government. Well, the federal government wasn't involved in this, nor was the state, nor was local government. This was all Mr. Pickens' own money. $1 billion of money that Mr. Pickens was prepared to pony up to make this deal happen. He pitched it to San Antonio, came in at $700, $800, $900 an acre foot. It was eminently doable for the city's water portfolio. For the moment, they decided to take a pass. He hasn't given up. He's now come back with some other proposals with some of his neighbors to try and pitch it to some western Texas cities. One message from this story is very simple. Water has a value that we have not previously appreciated or understood. I'm going to skip over a number of stories in the interest of time. You know, this is my home state, Massachusetts, and this is real. Well, not the ridiculous putting of the kayak there. You know, that was staged. But this is, unfortunately, the Ipswich River. And the Ipswich River, just north of Boston, let me go back, just northwest of Boston, famous for Ipswich clams, has gone dry in 4 of the last 8 years from groundwater pumping for suburban sprawl. Starter castles, 8,000 square feet, 7 bedrooms, 6 baths. California, yeah, the story I tell here is the local river, the Cosumnes River. I'm going to skip over it as well. It's the same story of sprawl. The Cosumnes is just south of Sacramento. All of you folks have priced people out of the housing market here, so the housing industry in the Cosumnes is in danger. One of the interesting things about the Cosumnes is it's got a strain of salmon that are endangered. And as you get, and the river itself will every year dry up, but only during the dry season. Then when the rainy season comes in, starting in November, the river fills up with water, the salmon dash up, make a mad dash upstream and spawn. Well, what's happening in the Cosumnes, the folks at UC Davis suggest, is that the groundwater pumping has lowered the water table, and now when the fall rains come, the river doesn't fill up as soon. It takes a longer period of time to fill in the dry pores that have been vacated by the groundwater pumping. I have 2 more stories to tell and then make some closing comments. This one is back in the Midwest, and this one has to do with French fried potatoes from McDonald's. Now, how many of you have eaten French fried potatoes from McDonald's? Yeah, you know, a lot of smiles and a few brave hands. Well, we've all eaten French fried potatoes from McDonald's. I mean, they are great French fries. And the genius of McDonald's as a franchise goes to Ray Kroc and his understanding that if you want a great fry, I mean a really great fry, then you have to start with the potato with a high water content. Potatoes really are almost all water to begin with. I mean, think about it. You buy a bag of potatoes, you put them under the sink, you forget about it, you come back and you go, ugh. You know, but that's dehydration, and then something else begins. But they shrivel up because they lose their water. Well, he wanted high water content because the process of making a French fry is the process of extracting the water and replacing it with fat. That's why it tastes so good. I mean, how many of you eat raw potatoes? I rest my case. You want the fat, and preferably with a lot of salt. So we need potatoes with a high water content. And in the mid-1980s, McDonald's changed their marketing strategy, and they went to supersized. Before then, some of us in the audience are old enough to remember, we bought French fries from McDonald's, and they came in little white wax paper bags that would fall over and make a bit of a mess. Not anymore. Now they come in a rigid carton with rigid sides. And from that point on, McDonald's would only buy potatoes from farmers who irrigate. Because if you irrigate, you get what's called an industrial potato. A potato with the same uniformity as your watch or your computer or a microphone or an automobile. There's no odd shapes and sizes anymore. Go to the produce section of the co-op and you'll see the potatoes, they're all the same. I mean, that you could juggle with them, for goodness sakes. You know? That's not the way potatoes used to be. They used to be all kinds of wild sizes and shapes. Not anymore. Now they're pure white, blemish-free, and most especially, the exact length necessary to stick out of the supersized carton to be grabbed between thumb and forefinger and dipped in the ketchup. When I heard the story, I just, no, if you think I'm going to write that up and put my name on it, you know, this is madness. And I had it confirmed. And this is a wonderful water folly involving the Straight River. And people say USGS has no sense of humor. No. This is a new use of water in the United States that has received no attention. We know farmers in California and Arizona irrigate. You have to irrigate. We're in a desert, for God's sakes. But in the Midwest, people are irrigating? Yeah, now they are. Now, I tell stories about blueberry growers in Maine and potato farmers in Minnesota and small grains producers in Georgia who are required by bank obligation to irrigate if they want their money. This is a new, huge use of water, putting more pressure on the resource. And why? For the folly of growing the perfectly uniform potato. You could grow perfectly fine potatoes elsewhere. Farmers have been doing it in Maine for years, but you wouldn't have the same uniformity. The picture here shows you the huge Centerpivot irrigation systems, the big circles. You see them especially flying at 35,000 feet above the earth. And you can see that this one on the bottom goes right into the apron of the river. For the moment, the Straight River is okay. It's been saved, if you will. The farmer up there, R.D. Offutt, who's the huge grower of potatoes and also the largest John Deere dealer in the United States, has worked with the environmental group Trout Unlimited. He put a bunch of money in their hands to do a hydrologic study of the area. He's moved some of his wells to a deeper aquifer. He's moved the processing plant wells away from the river. So he's been a good soldier in all of this. But the Department of Natural Resources in Minnesota has no discretion to deny permits for pumping groundwater. And there's a tall stack of applications waiting to be processed. Minnesota, like Wisconsin, and many of these other states, like California to some degree, like Arizona, has the reasonable use doctrine. You want to put in a well, you just go right ahead. I'm going to jump over this one. It's very interesting, and another one in Nevada. This one's two mining things, both involving native peoples, and an interstate dispute in the American West. To get to the last story, the Grand Canyon. This story is about the future of water. How many people have been to the Grand Canyon? Oh, almost everyone. Well, what a resource. What an amazing place, huh? You know, just one of the great splendors on Earth. Unfortunately, we are loving it to death. Between 5 and 6 million of us visit the Grand Canyon every year. The facilities are in a terrible state of disrepair. Housing for park employees and concessionaires is abominable. Air pollution is dreadful. Traffic jams are bad. Not quite LA or Bay Area, but still, we got problems with the Grand Canyon. The story I tell here is about a proposal for a development made by a Scottsdale, Arizona developer and his partners for a land swap with the Forest Service. And what they proposed to do was to take, all in through here is a large national forest, and the developer and his partners owned 2,200 acres of land in the national forest, in holdings. They wanted to trade that 2,200 acres of land for 270 acres of land in the little town of Tucson. Now, those of you who've been to the Grand Canyon, most of you probably visited the South Rim first, and maybe you hiked down, maybe you didn't. But the South Rim is just north of Tucson, and Tucson's maybe 10 miles from the rim, just outside the park and surrounded by the National Forest. The developer made this pitch, and the Forest Service thought it was a good idea. At that point, they needed to do an environmental impact statement because the land swap was a major federal action. It triggered the requirement that you prepare an EIS. They did the EIS. The EIS asked, what are you going to use for water? They said groundwater. What are the consequences of using groundwater? The EIS concluded it would somewhat diminish the flow in Indian Garden Creek. Now, if any of you have hiked down to Phantom Ranch at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, you probably went down the Bright Angel Trail, and halfway down you would have encountered this incredible oasis, this spring. That's Indian Garden Creek. It's a marvelous oasis, a perennial flow, shade, a chance to fill up your canteen. It's a very restful, very special spot. The EIS also said that it would diminish the flow somewhat in Havasu Springs. Now, if any of you have rafted the Grand Canyon, you know that Havasu Springs comes in about 2/3 of the way through your trip, river left. It's that turquoise body of water. It looks like it should be in the Caribbean, not in Arizona. It's just a breathtakingly beautiful spot. Well, when this was announced, that this was going to be the consequence, people were just incensed that people could think about doing these things that would harm the Grand Canyon. So the developer realized, this is dead. This is not something you tweak. This proposal is DOA. I need to do something else. So the developer huddled up with the Grand Canyon National Park, with the National Forest folks, with the two principal tribes, with the Grand Canyon Trust and another important environmental organization that works on Grand Canyon issues. And they came up with a new idea, a new proposal. And this is the future of water. They would purchase some Colorado River water rights, and the Colorado, of course, goes all the way down this border. They would divert the water at Topic, which is about here. They would put the water on Burlington Northern Railroad tankers, and they would move the water 180 miles by railroad to the town of Williams, where they would offload the water. They would then put the water in a pipeline that they would build 50 miles long at a cost of $15 million, and they would move the water from Williams up to Tucson, where they would use it on the development. Now, this proposal was going to cost a lot of money. They added up all of the figures, and it was going to cost $20,000 per acre foot to do this deal. Now, I want to put that figure in perspective. The Imperial Irrigation District, right here in California, in southeast California, the Imperial Irrigation District and the Palo Verde, right about up there, pay between $12 and $15 an acre foot. The Welton Mohawk Irrigation District pays $15 an acre foot. This was $20,000 water. Ladies and gentlemen, farmers couldn't make a profit with $20,000 water growing marijuana. The developer took these figures, gave the figures to the accountant crunched the numbers, and the accountant said, it's a go. It's a go. And you know, and they had all kinds of things. They were going to be harvesting water off of rooftops. They had a gray water system for washing machine and water that wasn't toilet water. They had drip irrigation. They had low flow fixtures. They had all kinds of things that won them awards from landscape designs and architects. You would too if you had to pay $20,000 water. So they look at this, they realize it's a go, and the reason why it's a go and the reason why we need to rethink our way of conceptualizing water is if you stop thinking about water in terms of acre feet, and you go back to Perrier, $20,000 water turns out to be 6 cents per gallon. Just the cost of doing business for a development at the gateway to one of the great splendors on earth. The Coconino Board of Supervisors approved the deal. At that point, the hotel interests in Williams, Flagstaff, and Tucson were unhappy that there would be some competition. There would have been some hotel units and motels in this development, and they mounted an initiative campaign. At the 11th hour, the Sierra Club and the Center for Biological Diversity split company with the rest of the environmental groups, and they decided to oppose it. It went to the voters where it was overwhelmingly defeated. I was sorry to see it defeated, in part because it took these 2,200 acres of land that are still owned by the developer and his partners out of the picture. It consolidated those holdings in the Forest Service. Under Arizona law, they can develop that land and put in wells using the reasonable use doctrine. So this was a development I thought would have made a great deal of sense. But whether I think it makes sense or not is really quite inconsequential. It's the future of water in the same way that the T. Boone Pickens story is the future of water. Water has a value that we have not appreciated. $20,000 water is not a problem. It just is a cost of doing business. So, what do I make of all of this? Well, this is the tragedy of the commons. It is the classic access, limitless access to a finite resource. What's causing it? Well, of course it's population growth. That's every environmental problem. You can't name one that isn't about population growth. I can't do much about population growth, so I'm going to move on. How about the waste of water? Oh, you bet. And each of us, I expect, has our own little pet peeve about what the worst waste of water is. But instead of dealing with things, we get the gap between law and science, and instead of reform, we get fixes. We get refilling the lake. We get creative ways to deny reality. That's what we have, not solutions that come to terms with the problem. So what do I think then? What do I make of all of this? Well, first, I would like to convey this evening a sense of urgency. And the simple fact is that as we sit here today or tonight, groundwater pumping that has already occurred is going to create these harms, dry up lakes, rivers, wetlands, estuaries in the future, years or even decades out, because groundwater moves slowly. And it's getting worse. We're pumping more groundwater. So there is a sense in which we must change direction. We must curb this absolutely unsustainable use of groundwater. How do we do that? We need to do two things. We need to recognize both that water is a public resource and that there are aspects of private property to it. We need government rules and regulations, but we also need market forces. Why government rules and regulations? Because the market is notoriously incapable of internalizing environmental harm. Let me explain briefly. Perrier/Nestle doesn't care if the trout in the McCann River don't reproduce. That's not on their watch, not on their property, not their concern. So actions that a company or an individual takes that have environmental consequences that are not paid by that company or individual are instead paid by everyone else or not paid by anyone. They're cost to a degraded environment. And we see this all over the place. So we need government rules and regulations to make up for that market failure. What kind of government rules and regulations? This isn't rocket science. You can't put the well in next to the spring. No, really pretty straightforward. In the book, I have a menu of options for what the states can do. Conservation is certainly part of it, but conservation is not all of it. We in Arizona have had, especially in Tucson, aggressive conservation programs. We still are not in balance. We need to look elsewhere. And the place we need to look to is the fact that we haven't appropriately valued water. We need to use market forces. In the United States, we use a huge amount of water to grow low-value crops, cotton and alfalfa being the poster child or children for this use. We need to use market forces to encourage willing sellers to trade their water with willing buyers. The metaphor I have is, if you've got this milkshake glass with all of these straws, if you want to put in a new straw, you have to pinch someone else's straw. You have to buy out that water right. And then finally, I want to end on a bright note. I want to raise your water rates. We aren't paying a sufficient amount of money for water. And you say, well, I pay a lot. You know, East Bay Mud just sent me this dunning notice last week that I hadn't paid them. Well, with all due respect, if you look at the rate components of East Bay Mud's bill, or any other water supplier, whether you get it from a water utility under the auspices of the mayor and council, or whether you get it from a private company regulated by the State Public Utility Commission, it doesn't matter. The rate structure in both instances is the same. What you're paying for is the cost of service. It's the cost to deliver the product to you. There's no commodity charge for the product. The water is free. Try that out when you leave here at night and you stop for gas. Pull into the Texaco station and offer to pay the attendant a portion of his $5.75 an hour minimum wage and a piece of the utility cost for Texaco to pump the gas. You know, that's not going to work. So what we have is a scarce commodity, but because we have, through our legal system, given the rights away, we're not paying for the water. So we as a community need to begin a dialogue on how to encourage water conservation by beginning to price water appropriately. It's a sensitive topic, a delicate topic. It's one I'm really charged about, and I could spend a long time talking with you about it. I'm not going to now. If you want afterwards to chat with me about it, I'm more than happy to go into some of the details of how we do it. So in the end, I'm optimistic because there are things you can do. There is a menu of options, but we need to recognize the problem, and then we need to take some corrective steps. We need to move this ocean liner's course just a little bit, because then if we do, there is reason to be optimistic, because Mother Nature is remarkably forgiving, and she must somehow or other be smiling at some of our foibles, our water follies. And if we can just move the ship a little bit over, then there is hope to think that the rivers will still flow and the springs will bubble. Thanks. Thank you. Thanks. Thanks. Thanks, Roy. Take care, friend. Bye. Sure, of course. In the back, please.
From the Bay Area to Sacramento about 3 months ago, we don't pay for water in Sacramento at all. There's no meters.
There will be.
Yeah.
There's a new piece of legislation just passed, and that's true in many areas in California, and you're not alone. You pay nothing for water. And in Fresno, California, the residents there use per capita about 300 gallons a day. I think it's 300 gallons. 300. In nearby Clovis, they use 200. The difference, there are water meters. Yeah. Sir?
I think one of the things we have to do as a society is to actually decide that we're not going to throw water out to sea as fast as we can. We have to actually say we want to keep the water on the land so there's a chance to percolate into the groundwater. Which is what, if you look at Davis, there's a City Homes Davis project. Yes. There's a series of swales. That's what we start doing to our landscape in general, on a massive scale.
You ever hear that? Yeah, that's a terrific point. Let me play. Well, let me play devil's.
Groundwater running for a much longer time.
Well, let me see if I can bridge the gap between the two. Maybe not play devil's advocate, but argue his position. One of the things I discovered here is that in the past, we've thought about water that flows out to the ocean as being wasted. But it turns out that, especially for estuaries, that fresh water is what provides the critical mix of fresh and salt water to allow for the reproduction process to go on and to keep saltwater predators at bay from eating the little clams or shrimp or whatever. So it's a delicate problem. But leaving the water flowing out to the ocean aside for a moment, we need to do a better job with land use planning, as you suggest, sir, in slowing the movement of water to saving it. And the story, I do tell it in the book, the Massachusetts story on the Ipswich River, goes into that, because what they've realized is they need to keep water local, to keep it in the watershed. And one of the ways you do that is by having land use patterns that will take runoff, halt the runoff, or at least slow it down and allow more percolation. So I think your point's a good one.
Water for every farm. It should be compulsory reading for anybody who wants to get into water engineering of any kind.
Okay, thanks. Sir.
Do you have an opinion on the future of environmental law, the case law or legislative? We do a lot of groundwater work around Monterey Bay with seawater intrusion, and a lot of the projects we work on are being halted because the law isn't clear as far as how much we can charge, how much the agencies can charge, and the rights of an agency to charge for groundwater, for people who use groundwater to correctly manage it. Yeah. And basically these projects that are collapsing because of lawsuits from a handful of people when the entire area benefits.
Right. Well, I think, if I go back to the tragedy of the commons again, California law largely leaves groundwater unregulated. There's some exceptions, but largely it's unregulated. And so if the longer I can pump water, the more I benefit from it. And the original, as most of you know, the original theory of the tragedy of the commons is if I put in a new straw into the glass, it makes the situation worse for everyone. But for me, it makes it better. I get that water. So I benefit. So a rational economic being will put yet another straw in the glass because that straw, the benefit of that water goes 100% to the person who puts in the straw, but the harm is diffused among everyone who has a straw and among the community. All right.
You mentioned that law has not yet caught up with science. At least from the California experience, you can say. Maybe that's not the best way to say it, because many of the lawyers do know enough of rational and logic to catch up with science. But there are other forces that are acting opposite.
Sure.
And the second comment I want to make was that I understand that many states like Nebraska are already mandating natural resource districts where surface water and groundwater will be managed together. At least there has been a start to set aside these physiographic units for management. We have to go some ways, but I think the start has been made. Nebraska may not be alone. Maybe there are other states which are doing it.
So the first point I think is correct. We now know how water moves. The scientists have told us that. But for various reasons, including that economies have been built on this groundwater source, that's at least what the Arizona Supreme Court said, they refused to revisit it. If the state legislature wanted to change it, it could. Well, it hasn't. As for the second one in Nebraska, they have passed this bill creating natural resource districts. I've been uncharitable, shall I say, in the way I've described the way that these work. I think it's essentially the fox being in charge of the chicken coop. My favorite Nebraska folly involves the town of Grand Island, Nebraska. It's right on the Platte River. Grand Island has wells on the island in the middle of the river, and it's deemed to be groundwater that they're pumping from these wells. So they've got a ways to go. The state, though, Nari, that has done well is the state of Washington. And they have a prior appropriation system that integrates both ground and surface water. And the state legislature has instructed its Department of Ecology to set a minimum flow for all rivers in the state. That then becomes an appropriation for the rivers. Well, you've been very kind. The last question, sir, and then I'll stay around for a while and chat. And I'm obviously passionate about these issues, but you've been kind and going quite a long time. So final comments.
Just a question. You lay so much of the blame on the lack of an appropriate legal and regulatory framework that would allocate the resource correctly. Can you comment on the argument that we see in so many developing countries today against the private sector participation, which does not account for that issue that you have identified, which is the lack of the public policy and legal and regulatory frameworks? And is there a position for the private sector to play in water resource and project development in challenged countries?
That's a terrific question. And I would like to talk with you at more length than I will be able to right now. The privatization issue is a dicey one. my quick and down and dirty answer would be privatization, it depends on how it's done. The devil is in the details. Opponents of privatization, and there's some great ones. If you haven't read the book Blue Gold by Maud Barlow, it's a fabulous book. Check it out. She's very articulate. But what she hasn't done is to tell us what her alternative is. If you're not going to do it through privatization, then how are you going to distribute the resource? So that's one thing. The second thing, and this is really critical to distinguish what's happening in some third world countries or developing countries from the United States, is that in the United States we have a strong tradition of democratic oversight of private companies through our public utility corporations. And they are very consumer oriented in almost every state. They don't work magically, and there are problems, but they're there. And they're often not there in some developing countries. And the really sad part, and you know, if you don't know the work of Peter Glick right here in Oakland, best commentator on water in the United States, just fabulous guy, won a MacArthur a year ago. Check him out, the Pacific Institute right here in Oakland. What he and Gary Wolf and his colleagues there suggest is that the saddest part is that the very places in the third world that most need an infusion of private funds from outside are the precise places without the political oversight, without a good, strong government that can control these private sector inputs. Well, that's a quick answer to a very complicated question. Again, thanks very much. Thank you.